Good afternoon. I'm getting ready to leave town for a couple days, but I had this on my mind and I wanted to make this video before I left, or I might forget my thoughts and I might forget to make the video. So we had a brief discussion about Synbaroum in the Discord the day after. Dell did his. I hadn't seen Dell's video before I made my video. I went on Discord and chatted with the guys before I made my video. Then I saw Dell's video afterwards. But I want to talk about one reason why I think Synbaroum is about deliberate play, right? And this is an example of how mechanisms, this is an example of why system matters and how the mechanisms and the system design inform play whether we like it or not, right? So somebody could argue, oh no man, Synbaroum's the perfect hex crawl game. And I would argue, if you're looking at the core rule books, I'd say yes. However, it's clearly, to me, based on the core rule books, it is meant to be deliberate play, meaning you're going to have a prepared thing. And I'm going to pick one example that to me proves again how system informs play and how system matters. System directs what really as a GM you're required to do for the session. And this is one reason why I prepared a thing as opposed to randomness. And this partially informed me because when I created Dell's character and I gave him fortune telling as his ritual, as a self, because I had to create Dell's character for him, fortune telling, this ritual mechanic from the core rulebook alone makes my argument as to why Synbaroum is meant to be, in a way, a deliberate game, meaning there's usually an adventure, there's something to do. You're meant to have a thing. This alone. This falls under witchcraft for rituals. With a successful resolute test, the mystic may ask one yes or no question regarding the adventure. Fortune telling can only be done once per adventure, and further attempts are only possible when something major has come to pass, potentially changing the future. The game master decides if such an event has occurred. But let's break this down. With a successful resolute test, the mystic can ask a yes or no question regarding the adventure. Well, that implies that the GM can answer that question, which implies we know what's coming. Okay? Second, it can only be done once per adventure. Further attempts can only be possible when something major has come to pass. Major, again, implies something in the adventure has triggered, or something in the results of the prepared adventure has resolved and therefore changed the story, okay, the events, right? So that's the second reason one rule makes 3 points to me that suggest it's deliberate. You should have some kind of module, adventure, something written with some understanding. The characters will partake, right? And then the final piece of this is potentially changing the future. The game master decides if such an event has occurred, right? So again, that implies that the GM knows the outcome. That implies the GM knows the future, etc. Therefore, they would know if something major has occurred that's changed the future, right? They encounter a witch. That witch was predestined to later show up. They're supposed to have a meeting with a witch and have an encounter that wasn't ultimately meant to end in violence, but somehow in scene 4 they end up killing the witch that's supposed to show up later in the module for the final battle, but they've killed her in scene 3 when she was really supposed to be the monster in scene 12, right? Now what do we do, right? Okay, that's how player agency also changes pre-written adventures. There's no reason why that could not have occurred. There's no reason why they could not have ultimately tried to deal with the Blackcoats in my pre-written game, and that might have led them on a whole nother path that I would have to, for the most part, make up as I go, right? So, but this is, again, when we're talking about the core rule book, we're talking about how system informs play, and I'm reading actual mechanisms that characters will use as abilities, traits, spells, etc., and they directly relate to something like being able to answer the yes or no question. For instance, if we're doing an expedition or an excursion, which is all random, And Dell says, I'm going to do my ritual and I'm going to focus. And he asks that question. He does his ritual and we're all sitting there at the camp waiting for him to finish. And he says, his eyes pop open and he says, will we find an artifact in this dig? I can't answer that question. There's no way to answer that question because they're going to roll randomly for the excavation. They're actually going to roll randomly to get to the ruin if we're using the expedition rules. And then they roll randomly. All of them roll randomly as they dig holes, as they look for treasure. I can't possibly answer that question because they have to roll it. It's not. So that is the kind of thing that informs me. Synbaroum was not, I hate to say it, it's the after effects, so to speak, of adding rule systems that support a further use of the engine, right? Like hex crawling is what I'm calling it. Hex crawling. They don't call it hex crawling. But the gist of it is, if he asked me that question, I would have two things. I'd have to say no and make sure they don't roll an artifact, which would be cheating, or I'd have to say yes and make sure they roll an artifact, which would be cheating. Therefore, that simple ritual tells me I'm supposed to know certain things about the adventure, right? If he had said, will I die in this adventure? I would say, well, there's no way for me to answer that question. I don't know if you're going to die. Nobody knows if you're going to die, right? That's a question I would say that's not a yes or no question, right? If he said to me, did a ritual at an excursion excavation, so I said, will we find an artifact here? I would say I can't. That's not a yes or no question. I can't answer that question. It is a yes or no question, but technically it's not, in the sense that my knowledge, my omniscient knowledge as the GM, would be able to say definitively, yes, you will, right? So again, that implies that any question they ask won't be related to dice rolls, right? So when Dell says, is the Iron Pact at the final ruin? That is a yes or no question. There's no dice rolls right? It implies, it doesn't imply, they still have to go to that ruin. They could have said, well, we're not going there. Dude, the Iron Pact, that's crazy. We're going somewhere else. That's fine. They could have gone back to the small ruins and excavated the small ruins. So they still had complete player agency to say, we're not ready for the Iron Pact, and an aborted mission. They have complete control of that. But that is one simple rule that players actually have access to for their characters that again, we can't deny in all role-playing games, the character is the chief vehicle in which the players participate in the game that we call role-playing. Therefore, we cannot ignore that the players can utilize a tool or mechanism that ultimately directs what I can do as a GM in preparation, right? And that's a fine example that tells me Synbaroum is definitely more adventure driven. It is definitely more than just random hex crawling, right? Than random play. So I would not necessarily, for instance, I would not use naive narrator style GMing for Synbaroum, despite my joy of it, and despite for instance Dell's preference for it. Synbaroum I like because I will prepare things and I will know certain answers, and I'm okay with that. Again, I'm a GM that can do it all, right? I'm willing to do naive narrator. I'm willing to write campaigns. I'm willing to write adventures. I mean, you shouldn't be, as a good GM, I don't think should be adverse to using all the tools to our disposal. And certainly a good GM should never ignore the intent of the game that they're running to suit their preferences in particular, right? The minute I choose to make Synbaroum completely random as a GM, which you could do, and I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying you could certainly do this, you could homebrew this, then Dell's character's ritual of fortune telling is now rendered pointless, or I have to cheat, right? Now, in a different style of game, where we are doing, in a way, writer's room creation, this would not be rendered useless, because the power would be on Dell to basically declare the yes or no answer, and then we ultimately have to account for the fact that Dell's predicted they will find an artifact. How are we going to write a room that they discover the artifact, right? That's a different intent. It's a different role-playing game with different intentions. But I wanted to make this video quickly before I'm gone for a couple days. I knew I would either forget or I would not be as concise to my point. So thank you for watching. I'll upload this video when I get home. Thanks. Bye.